Okay, so I'm Zach Kessin. I am the author of Building Web Applications with Erlang, also a book on HTML5, which I don't have copies of. I'm also the host of the Mostly Erlang podcast, which is a weekly or almost weekly podcast, mostly about Erlang, but occasionally into other things. And a couple weeks ago on the podcast, we were having a discussion about various things, and I probably should stay over here. Brian Hunter, who's not here today, commented that for a lot of people, part of the thing is, how do you set up a build environment? How do you set up your various environments to work with Erlang? And if you're somebody who's from sort of the IDE world, and you didn't catch the IntelliJ talk yesterday, I guess go watch it on video when you get home. Diving into Emacs and this stuff is, might be a little intimidating, so I just wanted to cover some of that. That's me. Who am I? I'm director of API at Product Structure. We are a small startup in Tel Aviv. We build drop-in components, so if you don't want to write your own login registration form for your web app, we will happily provide you one line of JavaScript, A/B testing, the whole works. I'm the host of the Mostly Erlang podcast. Subscribe there. And you can find me on Twitter there. Please follow me if you want to follow me, I think. And I work for Product Structure. We build, like I said, pre-built components that will drop into your web page. So I want my workflow. I spend however many hours a week writing code, and I want it just workflow that's just going to get out of my way and let me work. Which means code. You should be able to create code with templates, sometimes generate it. Do exploratory testing. Automatically, when I hit save, I want things to compile, and so on. So this is my goal. Don't quite have it all perfectly yet. We're still working on the tools for this. And this is, I think, one place where Erlang kind of falls short for people who are used to the IDE world of Java, where, you push one button and it does everything. Of course, it's not repeatable on your colleague's computer necessarily, so, So the first tool is Erlang mode for Emacs. It comes with Erlang, so it doesn't have a URL. It provides a lot of sort of utility for Erlang. It does code syntax highlighting. You can compile from the, has templates for everything from, if you forget how to do a receive block, or you need a gen server, you can just pull off a menu and it says gen server, and poof, you have a whole file. And also, by the way, if you type your module name, you're creating a module and the module name doesn't match the file name, when you hit save, it'll say, hey, your module doesn't match the file name. You want me to change it for you? You click yes, and it fixes it, which is really great. Certainly, I just type module A, save, and then it fixes it to the file name. So it's a really nice start, but it's not really up to, necessarily doesn't do everything I would want. So how can we expand it? So the first thing is Rebar, which isn't really connected to Emacs. It was created by Basho, although I'm reliably informed that they don't maintain it anymore. One of the guys there told me that yesterday. I didn't actually know that. And it is a build tool that understands OTP. It understands the basic structure of your OTP file, of your project, and how OTP works. So if you're following the OTP design principles, a source directory, approved directory, and so on, Rebar is your friend. And you can follow that GitHub repo. All right. Can everybody read the text okay, by the way? Okay. So first thing you can do with it is you can create a project skeleton. So here you can see I went to a command line and I created an app ID EUC 2013. And it created files for me, an app.source file, and EUC app and a supervisor. It doesn't create any actual workers. But those are just created for you. Just one command line, boom, you're done. I'll just take that to-do out. So I'll show you what it creates. So you can see here, you have a basic supervisor. Can everybody read it? Okay. I hate being the one sitting in the back who can't read the slides, so I don't want to be, and then it creates an app file, and then when you build it, it fills in the modules and stuff. So it lets you sort of just, again, you create an app file. It's a really basic app file, but much of the time this is all you need. So you don't really need to, you want to just create those basic files to start up. Just do it in the command line, and if you forget the syntax of this command line, you just type rebar-c, and it gives you all the options, because I don't remember it either. I never remember command line switches. All right, so this thing, once you actually compile it in the root directory of your file, you need a rebar config file. Now, the rebar config file is just a list of Erlang terms. This is the simplest possible Erlang config file. It's simply a comment that tells Emacs to put it into Erlang mode. And by the way, the comment is optional. You basically could put a blank file there. It would still do some useful default. But you might want to do something useful. So for example, here is something out of a project I'm working on now. And my project is for OTP apps. You can see they're called utils, WM, eDarwin, and auth that do something. It's actually clipped out of a larger file, but that's it. And you can see that basically just that. Now when I do rebar, when I compile, it just is going to go into all those directories and compile them automatically, and I don't have to worry about it. Very similar to make, but a little easier to set up. The other nice thing is it can do is if your project is dependent on external files or external utilities, you've downloaded Web Machine and JSX, which is a JavaScript JSON library, just if you didn't know it, and 47 other things off of GitHub, that you can just put deps in your rebar config file. You give it the application name as an atom. You can put a version number, and then, well, it's cut off, and I'm sorry about that. Let's see if I can adjust that. Okay, well, hold on. Can you still read that? I'll put it back up in a minute. Basically, you get the GitHub URL, and then you basically put a reference to what you want it to pull out of GitHub. It also does Mercurial and Subversion, by the way, and doesn't just use GitHub. You can use your own local Git server. You can use your own Bitbucket, what have you. And you basically can just tell Rebar to just fetch all the dependencies. The other thing you can do is you'll notice this third column, which the second one is just wrapped because it's long. The bottom one, it says head, and that's just going to grab the head of the master branch of your project. Now, the thing is, you might not want to do that, because if you've got lots of dependencies and some of them change, then you can get into version chaos where, they update Web Machine and they introduce some new incompatibility with your code, and suddenly you're spending 12 hours, you're up till 2 in the morning figuring out why something doesn't work. So what you can do is you can see the top line, I have 377650, which was the most recent commit on Web Machine as of whenever I wrote this morning sometime, maybe a more recent one. And that'll tell it basically do the same thing, except instead of getting the head repo, the head of the repo, it'll take a specific commit. So you can be sure that like all of your servers and all of your development environments are using a consistent version of Web Machine, or whatever your element is, so that, if 5 of us are working on a project, you can see if you said head, head, that depending on when we pulled it, we may have 5 different versions of that dependency. And that, suddenly you could get really weird Heisenbugs where things are confused and stuff. The other thing is the middle one, you can also say a specific branch. You can pull the devel branch from that project there. So if you have a specific one. Anybody questions, by the way? Okay. If you have questions, please, raise your hand, shout, whatever. Okay. The other thing you can do is if you're running tests through Rebar, you can, let me raise the font size. You can basically put code coverage. You put cover enabled, cover print enabled will print in your compilation a percentage of coverage for each file. Cover enabled prints out as an HTML file, and then cover export enabled exports it into a raw data format that you can import into Erlang and do cool things within Erlang. Okay. And then to actually do a build, you type rebar get deps, which will go out and get all the dependencies. You can grab it off of GitHub and download it and compile it. Then rebar compile, which goes and just compiles everything. And then rebar EUnit, and if you put skip deps equals true, it'll skip running the unit tests for all your dependencies, so you don't have to run the unit tests for rebar and not for rebar, for web machine and Moki Web and the 47 other things that pulled in just for your own project. You can of course leave that off, and there's also options you can tell it, only run this file's tests. Hint, by the way, if you have a lot of subdirectories, it'll compile them it'll run the unit test and compile them in the order you list the subdirectories. So if you have like 50 subdirectories, while you're working, move whatever you're working on to near the top of the list. That way you don't have to wait for it to run 87 other things for it to fail on the unit test you just wrote. Fail on that first. It'll save you a couple seconds per compile or more, depending on your machine and how big your project is. Okay. So that's rebar, and we'll come back to it in a minute. Next piece of the puzzle is Distel. Distel was a great idea. It's kind of suffering from bit rot. It basically is a project that allows you to have Emacs talk directly to the Erlang VM. You can do some useful things, like you can have Emacs, in theory you can do RPC between Emacs and Erlang. In practice, it's kind of suffering from bit rot. If you look on their webpage, the PDF of documentation they present is dated 2002. So you can imagine its state. It's flaky, but it's still useful. My favorite Distel thing is if you've ever, has any people used like e-tags in various languages? Okay. So like how in e-tags you can get Emacs to go from a function to wherever it's defined. Well, so with rebar, instead of using e-tags, it can actually, it's very nice, it can actually query the compiler or a running Erlang node and say, I have a function here, utils, convert to binary /2. Where is it defined? And it says, oh yeah, it's in this file over here with this path, directory path, on line 87. And then it just takes you right to it, so you don't need to have the separate file. It just knows where everything is. So that's a really helpful thing. And escape comma will take you back. That's nice. All right. So the next phase is, as you're writing code, you're typing, and you hit save. And what I really want is, I really want the file to compile without having, I used to do PHP, and for whatever else one can say about PHP, you don't have a whole compile cycle. The compile cycle is simply you save it, you reload it in the browser, and then it compiles and runs as you load. Obviously in Erlang, we have a separate compile. It's a compiled language, we have a separate compile step. But again, I don't want to necessarily have to take care of that manually. I want the computer to handle it. My tools should do this for me. So the first thing is you can just, from within the Erlang mode, if you hit Control-C, Control-K, it'll just pop open an Erlang VM and try to do C file name, which is great unless you include files in weird places or places it doesn't know about, in which case it suddenly goes, well, I don't know where to find this HRL file, and it will give you errors. So again, I just want to hit save and have it work. So go looking for more things. So compile and save and test my code without intervention. Yes, we can do that. Okay, so the first thing you looked at, I used was FlyMake mode, which is a mode for Emacs. As you type, it compiles. Literally just saves literally saves temp file into somewhere, /temp, I think, on a Unix-like machine, and compiles it. It's reasonably fast, but it doesn't know about include directories, so frequently it doesn't work because your file needs the project include file, which is over there. Finally, can't find it. And you need to have then 2 build configs. So you can configure FlyMake, and then you have to configure Rebar. Second of all, when you hit save, it doesn't actually build a new Beam file for you. It creates a bogus temp file somewhere, which doesn't load into Erlang. So it's kind of also, I've occasionally seen it crash Emacs, and other people have said likewise. They've seen it likewise. So we're working on it. So it's something else. So to move on, project make mode. Eric Merritt, who's here at the conference today, wrote this. Is he in the room, Eric? No, he's not in the room. He's around somewhere. It will take either make or rebar or other build, or presumably another build tool, but these two usually, and build it with the build tool. So now you're using one build process to build everything. If there's an error message that gets thrown up, you have a syntax error, you have a warning, whatever, it'll tell you. Let me show you what that looks like. So here, you can see I replaced the period with a comma. And of course, live demos never work. First rule of thumb. But it normally would color that line pink or blue, depending, and then sort of tell you what it was going on. And you can then go and see it. So it's a really nice addition. There are a couple problems with it that Eric, I talked to Eric and I talked about it over lunch, and he is working on some improvements. The main problem with it is if your rebar takes a while, it basically, your editor has to wait until rebar finishes completely before it does anything. So if your compile second takes 20 or 30 seconds, it gets really annoying. Now if you want to run unit tests, there are a couple options. You can just do escape x compile and then hit a command line, just type, rebar EUnit, whatever, and that works. And it gives you a nice buffer where you see all the listings and you can look at what's passed and what's failed. The other option would be to have projmake run it. And to do that, you need a projmake file, which you put in your file directory. It can be either projmake or .projmake. Use the dot version if you don't want it in your Git repo. And projmake will work without it. You just sort of get something by default. But this is sort of what it looks like. And you see it's just an Emacs lisp file, name, and then shell here. This long command is the command that actually, runs when you hit save. So the problem with it is it doesn't yet know how to part. EUnit assertion errors don't look like make errors, so it doesn't know how to parse them yet. Eric and I we're talking about it at lunch. It'll probably happen sooner or later. You may have gotten that a lot of these tools seem to be work in progress. So I feel like this is the prologue to the story more than the story itself. And I think as an Erlang community, we need to improve this story. So this is not a place we need to rest. I think we need to improve our tool set. Because, if our colleagues who are used to IDEs look at this, they're going to go, you want me to use that? And, I'm not using this. And you go back to Java or C#. Okay, so when you compile or have code coverage information from Erlang, you can actually export this directly from Erlang, you can export it as HTML. It looks like this. This is some code. Don't worry about what it does. You know, it's web machine stuff. And you can see that those 3 or 4 lines up there that are colored red are not covered by my unit. There's no unit test for that function for whatever reason. Probably I just didn't write it. By the way, if you have other kinds of tests that you're running on your code, you can cover compile your code. You just put a flag into Rebar, and Erlang will gather coverage information. You run your tests, and you can export this file. This is not a Rebar thing. This is an Erlang thing. Look in the cover module, and you just, I think it's like a cover report. Look in the man page, you'll find a file. But it can export this file. So if we have another kind of test, like maybe you're running quick check against your file, or you're running, you know, if you've got a web API, maybe you've got some tests that, you know, with CURL or from a browser or whatever that come and exercise your API. And you want to know, okay, well, I've got a bunch of tests here, I've got a bunch of code. Is there any place in my code that my tests don't cover? You know, maybe my tests don't cover those 4 lines. This is from a unit test, but so you have a way that you can say, okay, just turn on coverage, run your tests, and see what's uncovered, and you can discover that, hey, those 6 lines there are uncovered. I should probably figure out why. Either delete the code or somehow test them. So that's a useful thing. It's in the cover module. If you're interested in code coverage in Erlang, the Erlang cover module, which you can, again, find in. I never remember all the options and parameters to this thing. But basically, you say analyze to file, cover analyze to file, and then you get module.cover.out, and you just give it the option HTTP there, and you see the parameters, and you get that file. So if you have other kinds of tests, you want to see how it covers. This is really useful. You can also do it asynchronously if you should so need. But that's a useful thing because basically it means you can run lots of tests and figure out, you know, do I have holes in my testing? You know, there may be some weird corner case where, you know, this line of code never gets called by my some group of tests. You know, if you're testing the API, if you're testing an API, you know, from the API, and you set on coverage, and maybe everything you're testing, every request you're making is requesting gzipped or non-zipped data, you know, data, and you never test that this will actually give you a proper zipping of data, then, you know, you'd see it in there. Well, I'm not actually sure because that's a weird case. That's not actually. This is just a fun. But that's sort of that. All right. So there was one thing I forgot to mention earlier about Rebar, and I apologize. So here, dependencies. By the way, if you have a big project with lots of subdirectories, one thing you can do as things stabilize is you can move your dependencies, you know, your parts of your project into separate repositories and move them into dependencies. This way you can separate them out into have different people responsible, have different, you know, separate them in your CI system if you have one, if you're using Jenkins or Travis or something like that, and sort of simplify things and sort of further isolate into smaller components your project, because I'm a firm believer that you're much better to have 10 small pieces than one huge project. You know, I like each source directory to have, you know, at most a couple hundred lines of code, and if it's more than that, I kind of feel like I'm doing something wrong. And I need to start breaking stuff up. All right. So thank you very much. Are there any questions? Sorry, I was a little shorter than me. Yeah, I can't see you real well.
Yeah, I just wondered, did you see the IntelliJ presentation?
No, I didn't actually.
Okay, we just wondered what you thought about it, because I thought it was really
no,
cool.
I'm not an IDE user. I did see the the other Emacs presentation yesterday morning. Thank you, I forgot the name. I knew it was E something something S. And I recommend for only if you weren't there and you use Emacs, when they post the videos, go watch it. Because that's also sort of a nice complement to this.
I was going to say.
Helps if you turn on the microphone.
I was going to say that if you're still using Distel, you should probably switch up to EDTS, the Erlang Development Tool Switch, which is, unless you, if you didn't see the presentation yesterday by Thomas Järvstrand, it's a more modern, very new library for Emacs for Erlang development.
I would have included it in there, except I only found out about it earlier this week. So, you know,
it hasn't been official for more than a few months.
Okay, well, you know, one of the other things that my other complaints about the Erlang tool community is we're not real good about getting the word out. You know, this cool new tool comes out for Emacs, and you know, people don't hear about it. You know, you can't use a tool. It could be the best tool in the world, but if you don't know about it, it's completely useless. So, first of all, if you're working on a tool, or you know somebody's working on a tool, please tweet about it, let Erlang Central know, and please let me know so I can put it on my podcast. This podcast is mostly Erlang.com. The other thing is if you're working on a tool and you'd like to come on the podcast and talk about it, or on a cool project, or a book, or anything else, please contact me. You can find my email easily enough via the podcast. You can just find me via the podcast, or I'll give you a business card. Any other questions?
All right, let's.
Yeah, would anybody like a free book? You had a question, so you get a freebie. It's all about yaws and stuff. Anybody else like one?
Good bribe, people.
You gotta ask a question. Doesn't have to be. I'm Zach. Okay, I'm Zachary. Yes. Thank you. That means I don't have to carry it back to Israel with me. Please read them and enjoy them. And thank you very much.